We're now at the top level of our mixing pyramid, which is the master bus. And I think what's really cool about this course and specifically about this section is that nothing really new is going to be presented to you here. You're thinking about these processors and ways of enhancing the sound the same way you've been thinking about it at the track level, at the group level, and now at the master bus level. The only difference is now you have your entire mix running through these processors. And for that reason, this is where you want to be the most subtle and light-handed with any of the processing that you're going to do. Because if you have to go extreme with the settings, you might as well go back to the mix and adjust it because you can do that. It's very simple to go back and say, okay, this isn't working. Let's change it around. So you're really right there. This is kind of the last 2 or 3% just to kind of tie everything together. And as we'll talk about in a little while, even just to bring up the volume a little bit, increase that perceived loudness because we still want to be, somewhat competitive, somewhat in the ballpark, even though this is really all about our vision and artistic freedom. So I want to make this point as well. Processing on the master bus isn't meant to replace a full-blown mastering session. And that's mainly because you've lost perspective again here. And at this stage, just like in the last stage, you want to take, a really pretty lengthy break in between because what you're going to be doing is needing to come back and listen with again hyper focus to hear what sort of really small changes you need to make. Not only that, but if you don't have the most critical or discerning ear, myself included here for sure, then you have to turn the volume up a little bit louder to really hear what it is you're doing. And the louder you turn the volume, the more you're trying to really focus in on the details, the faster your ears are going to fatigue, the quicker you're going to burn out. And this is one of the reasons why it makes a lot more sense to have your mix professionally mastered by somebody who's never heard the track before. And we're not talking about a professional mastering experience here, so it's not that important. But if we were to master our own work after finishing the mix, we should probably wait, upwards of a month so that we can really regain that fresh perspective. And even then, who knows if it's ever going to be fully regained. And the funny part is we might do the exact same things that professional mastering engineer would do that we're about to do. However, we are listening to it kind of unfairly. We really have spent so much time working on this song, especially if it's one that we've created, that it is hard to really listen to it and be critical of it because we have an expectation. We think it's good. We wouldn't be at this stage if we didn't think what we had done is pretty good and almost there. So the 3 principal reasons for processing on the master bus, none of these will come as a surprise to you, are number 1, cohesion. Very simple idea now at the master level. Everything is running through these processors, and just by the fact that all of the tracks are having to be summed together at the end and run through some kind of processor should bring things together. And if you think about an analog mixing console, you have that summing 2 amp at the very end, the master channel, the master bus, and the signals are actually going through a dedicated amplifier here, and so it is bringing them together. Obviously, in the computer, we're not going to be trying to necessarily mimic that kind of behavior, but we can do something similar by running everything through the same processor, even if it is something that's supposed to be very clean and very digital. Number 2, slight enhancement. So just like we've been talking about enhancement at the track and at the group level, same thing can be said about the master bus level. And it's the same exact techniques and applications we've already looked at. Do we want to add more bounce? Do we want to add more movement? Is there some kind of final EQ that we want to add to maybe just gradually shape everything a little bit together? Do we want subtle bits of excitation? Do we want to go with dynamic EQ? All of these things are questions you're going to ask yourself when you're listening through to that mix one final time from the broadest perspective you possibly can. What things can I do to bring this together? And then number 3 is loudness. And so with number 2 and number 3, you're oftentimes maybe going back and forth a little bit because the peak limiter or the maximizer that you use at the end can sometimes throw off balances a little bit. And then that's where the slight enhancement part comes in. So you're not necessarily going to try to go back to the mix and, change things around because you've brought in a peak limiter and it's changed balances. That might be a better time to just think, okay, can I do something really subtle before that peak limiter to then enhance the mix or to bring it back to where I thought it was going to be? And when we're talking about loudness here, we're talking about perceived loudness. So like RMS versus peak, every song that you make, you're going to want to have going up against the ceiling, whether that's, the digital zero ceiling or whatever. But here we can actually then again go back and compress those peaks down, bring up the overall loudness, and at least get in the ballpark. It's not that crucial or that important for us. And what I would say is you don't need to overdo it here. You just want to do it so it still sounds good without then adding additional saturation or distortion or any artifacts that you don't want. Don't worry, we will look at a couple of examples here, and I think this will make a lot more sense to you when we do so. So what you'll hear, really, to be at this stage, you should be very happy with your mix. And so the master bus isn't meant to be this extra 20 or 30%. It's really meant to be an additional 1 or 2%. Okay. And it's something that the average listener as well isn't really even going to know has happened here. Okay, it's very subtle. It's things that you often can just barely hear. You almost perceive them more than you necessarily hear them. However, when you go and you add the loudness and you really kind of reduce that dynamic range, you're going to hear a massive difference. But fundamentally, you're not trying to listen to and hear that change in loudness. You're trying to hear the structure and the balance of the mix that you've just finished. So fundamentally, the mix should sound basically the same with some very, very light enhancements, something that's maybe just going to give it that little bit of extra oomph that you're looking for that you couldn't achieve at the track or the group level. So if you've done a good job with the mix, there should be very little to do or worry about at this stage. And in fact, if you think that everything is good to go, after you've added that additional loudness, you know what? There may be nothing else you need to do, and that's A-okay. Reasoning and settings on processors can drastically vary here. Depends on the style of music that you're making, depends on what it is you're going for. So we'll look at two very different examples and talk through the thought process. So there isn't a one size fits all. This is about you making determinations, same as we've always talked about before, thinking of what processor will get me there, going in, applying it, listening. Does this help? Does this hurt? Okay. Do I keep it on? Do I leave it out? Same exact thing that we've been doing throughout this entire process. The fundamentals haven't changed, which is what I was just saying, only now you're applying the same techniques to the mix as a whole, and thus the subtle bits are going to go a much further way, and also why you're not going to go as extreme on settings, because it will radically alter the balances you've just set. If you put an EQ curve that's really sharp and really steep somewhere, that could be affecting a lot of instruments in a lot of groups, whereas we just want to get the mix as a whole to glue together just that little bit more. One of my tenets that we've said over and over again here, when in doubt, leave it out. If you don't have the most discerning or critical ear and you're not hearing a difference, just don't leave it in. It doesn't matter. You're going to have tons of experience. You'll get a lot of practice. The more music you make, the more you listen critically to other music, I think that's when you start to notice and hear, okay, this might be the thing I want to do. But if you're not able to grasp that just yet and you're a complete beginner, that's totally fine. There's no reason to destroy a mix just because you've seen somebody else applying a lot of different settings. It may not fit to the music you're making, and you have to be willing to be objective and say, okay, just because this may be a little louder, is it actually better? Does it suit the source material? So if you're not hearing a difference, or you feel what you're doing is actually taking away from the mix and specifically your vision of the mix, just leave it out. We're not professional mastering engineers, so the goal is really to make the mix sound great to you. So you're not so much worrying about the population as a whole. This isn't a professional application. When we talk about something that's professional, we're really thinking about making money for the most part. I mean, it's a sad world, but yeah, that's true. So a professional mastering engineer is thinking beyond just what sounds great to me. They're thinking what's going to sound great to the market, and they're going to apply the processing accordingly. We're not thinking that way. We're not trying to sell these songs. We're trying to express ourselves creatively and artistically. Do we still want to be a bit louder so that the listener doesn't have to drastically change their volume knob? Yeah, we do. But at the same time, when I'm listening to your guys' music and you're telling me the experience and or telling the whole community your experience and what you're going for with a track, I don't care if I have to turn the volume up a little bit. I'm listening to hear your vision, your artistic voice. So to me, just being like everybody else in terms of what you've done on the master bus, it's not going to impress me, and it's not going to make me look at your music any differently. I think we've really lost that kind of personal touch to music, sadly, and maybe if you think about it this way, we'll be able to get it back at least a little bit. So just the last kind of idea here is if adding gain is hurting your overall balances or it's really changing things around, you're hearing coloration and saturation and you're trying to, just get to the same level as everybody else, don't worry about that for right now. We do not have the exact same processors that the professionals have. We don't have the cleanest, most transparent limiters, and there are some really transparent ones now. So don't worry if you're not able to get to that level, because it may just be the processors you have aren't really designed to do that. So if adding gain is really hurting the overall balance, either A, don't add the additional gain. Someone like me and the other people on this website should have no problem turning it up a little bit if we need to. And B, you can go back to your mix and make adjustments if there's an adjustment that can be made. So if a balance goes slightly out of whack and you go back to the mixing session and maybe turn things a little bit and it helps, it fits everything in, that's fine as well. Again, in theory, if you've done a good job with the mix, if you're happy with the mix, if you've made it to this stage, small amounts of peak limiting shouldn't make a massive difference to the overall tone and dynamic. So enough talk, enough theory. Let's jump into the DAW and talk about some of the examples and thoughts you might have when you're working and processing on the master bus. We're going to revisit a couple of tracks from the first course, one of Paul's and one of mine, and talk about how the master bus processing can vary and change based on the style and type of track that you're working with, and how this is really all about your own opinion and what you're going for, and making sure that every move you make is an enhancement and not something that's actually taking away from the mix. Now, if it's your first time, it's totally cool to go a little bit harder with this, to go a little crazy with it. There's no rule saying that you can't do that. And I just think with time, you start to develop that experience and you really start to then hear what is an enhancement and what's more of a placebo. Because I think every time you drop a processor on, you think that it's just going to be better by putting on that effect. And that's just not always the case. So exercising restraint, it's a hard thing to do, but it is important. So when I brought this track in, the first thing I noticed is that it was going all the way to 0. Okay, so it was peaking out at 0, and so I just came in here and I brought it down by 3. That's really a nature of soundation, kind of making you want to work a little bit louder than maybe you should. Even so, this track sounds really good. So the balances are pretty much there, and I don't think it was pushing up against that ceiling incredibly hard, or if it was, it turned out to sound pretty good. Remember that with your mixes and the master bus processing, you'll see all of your groups and all of your tracks here. So if you do go with the master bus processing and you need to go back and make balance adjustments, you absolutely can do that. For the sake of example, I'm just doing it this way so that you can kind of see it and get a feel for it without the other distractions. But when you're doing it, you will still have all of your tracks and stuff here, and the processing will be applied down here on the master like we're doing in this example. And let's just go ahead and get into it. So I just usually go to the loudest part because I know that that's how I need to be eventually setting that max loudness level. And of course, at the end, you'll have to go back and listen to it all the way through. But in this track, the loudest part is around here. And what I do normally, and this would be even for my own tracks, is to look at the span and just see what are we looking like across the frequency spectrum. I don't really care that much what I see. I'm not going to go back and say, oh man, I need to change everything in the mix if there are big gaps. But I do just want to look at it because sometimes it can influence the moves that I'm going to make. So here we go. Okay, so a few things I see. One is we're looking pretty even across the board, which is good, which means that I can do things for enhancement's sake, not for like a fix-it kind of sake. This is a sort of spectrum that I'd be happy with seeing. I also can see down here at the bottom that we could probably go with some kind of high-pass filter to remove some of this lower rumble, probably go all the way up to 35 or 36, and that's really like the first thing that I would probably go in and do. But I want to make sure that it's making a positive impact. I'm expecting this music to be played back loudly. It's like a dance sort of song. So for that reason, I'm going to be playing it back louder so that I can really hear those enhancements. I also don't have like a subwoofer hooked up. So for that reason, I need to just trust that if I see stuff down there in those subsonic frequencies, that I can remove those and that it is having an added benefit. So let's jump in here and we're just going to go through these one at a time. I've already done it in advance, mainly because I just don't want my ears to fatigue between going through this track and doing my own. So I brought in the TDR Nova for this. I want clean processors. This is a dance track. This isn't necessarily about trying to get the same kind of glue as you might go with for a rock song. Okay, this is really about making sure those parts are distinct, that there's power, that there's energy, that the groove keeps going. It's really all about groove here. And so that's what I've tried to apply with these settings. Let me just go ahead and turn off those EQs first so that we can actually see what I did with the filter. So here it is. Analyzer in. Analyzer out. Subtle difference, but it probably does make an impact. Let's listen and hear if we can hear anything. It does seem to bring that kick drum into a bit more focus. So if you're able to get rid of some of those subsonic frequencies, it will have the effect of making that low end a bit more powerful, as you're hearing here. All right, the next thing I did, because I had the analyzer on, this is a sort of perfect opportunity to dip out those muddy frequencies, so to speak, but I'm not going to do it statically. I'm going to do it dynamically. This is a dance track. I want things moving. And if you notice, apart from the filter and the tiny little bit of high shelf I've applied, every other processor in this chain is about movement. Okay, because this is a dance song, so I want the movement to really be the focus. So let's go ahead and bring in the moves I've made. I did a small bump, this is also static, around the fundamental here. But you're not going to hear that big of a difference until we bring back in here number 2, which is just a bell here that's moving in time with the music, fast attack, pretty quick release. And you're going to hear how having this in is going to really enhance the low end. It's going to really keep driving this thing. And then that little bit of high shelf, just because it seems like it could use it. It's not a requirement at all. I just preferred the sound with it on versus without it on. Totally up to you if you think that helps the balance or not. So let's turn this off and turn it back on and see what we think. Yeah, I think that helps with overall clarity and bounce. And one final time, if you don't feel like this is making a difference in any way, shape, or form, just leave it out. The next thing I brought in here is a compressor, and I want to get additional bounce into this track before going into the loud max. So I've set this up like so. I took the peak crest and I moved it all the way to peak. If you go to the other side, you can have it respond specifically to RMS. You might want to consult the manual on that, but basically I only really want it reacting to the peak, and I want to have that kind of slower attack so I can really drive that through harder. Very quick release time here. I have the filter going so that it's not going to react as strongly to the low frequencies. Make sure we keep those stable, keep those strong, make that the focal point. And then again, the stereo sensitivity now plays a pretty big role because this track is in stereo. So having this up to 87%, good separation, but still enough cohesion. If you go higher than this, sometimes it starts to sound a little bit too obvious and weird between the two channels. So let's just listen to how this sounds. So there's more power, there's more of a driving force. And after I applied those two processors and I listened back, I really didn't hear like there was anything else to do. So I said, okay, let's go in here and let's max out the loudness here. And with this particular processor, it's not the cleanest in the world. It's pretty clean, but if you go too far, you'll really hear it starting to lose its energy. So I pretty much took this down until the point where I felt like, okay, I'm hearing maximum energy, and I'll just let you experience that here. Probably should have done an on and off. So down there, it loses all of its energy. It's just basically squashing it. It's squaring it out. That is not what I want for this track. I want there to be movement. I want there to be bounce. I'm not that worried if the overall RMS is like shooting through the moon. That doesn't matter right now. This is about bounce. This is about the vision of the track. So again... And to me, those three processors back to back to back do the job. It does what I want it to do, and this is where I would leave it. This is where I'd say my mix is done. Of course, a mastering engineer could probably do a lot more with it, but that's not the goal. This is just the vision for my mix, and I'm happy with how it turned out. All right, now we're going to look at my track, which sounds completely different, and I assume was created with very different purposes. I made mine, in one afternoon just for fun, kind of throwing things around, whereas Paul's really has that professional sheen to it. It seems like something that you could actually hear like in a club. And I assume our focus level when making the tracks were probably quite varied. He was probably very focused, really thinking about every move he was making, where for me it was kind of like just throw it at the wall and hope that it sticks. And for that reason, I'm guessing what we see in the frequency spectrum and the processing we're going to do is going to be quite different. So let's just take a listen here from in the middle where there's a decent amount of drums going on and see what's going on here.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity.
Okay, so this is a little out of balance, not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but clearly there are kind of gaps in this sort of mid-rangey kind of place, and I do think part of this has to do with maybe me making more songs that would be designed to have vocals or like maybe like a rapper in this area. But since there is no vocal lead or anything like that, we should probably make up for that a little bit. Also, the low end is really extremely loud in relation to everything else. And since I am doing this with the volume turned up higher, it leads me to believe that when I made the track, I probably had the volume much lower and was still trying to hear like that sub power. And so I really cranked it up. But that's something we can now address here in this master bus processing. And let's just start off by throwing on the TDR Nova again, turning the analyzer on and just seeing if there's anything really low down there that we want to get rid of. Part of my thought process here is I don't want to take it out entirely. I do want to leave it in, but just maybe pull back on it somewhat. It is a defining characteristic of the song, and I do want people to hear the low end even at low levels, but I would be a little bit nervous at higher levels of it just overblowing everything.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Okay, so I'm cool with that. I also might put in here a little bit of like a low shelf and just, again, let's see, what sort of cue would I want here? Probably something pretty smooth like that. And let's just have this move dynamically.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
curiosity. Nothing more than that.
And I'm thinking also just going in here more with the static process and just turning it down maybe a little bit more. Clearly, this would be something we would want to address in the mix, but obviously I can't go back and do that, so I'm having to do it here on the master bus, which is fine, but, you know, ideally you probably would want to be doing this in the mix.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
I think actually by putting in that static EQ, it seems to be actually really taking away a lot of the power, which is not what I want. So I'm just going to leave that out, I think.
Maybe we shouldn't.
I don't know. It's a
technique
tough
is
call.
perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Maybe we can make that a little slower so that it doesn't shoot up so rapidly. So when you hear that really low, like, boo, it sort of comes up a little bit more gradual. That might sound better.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more.
Okay, so that low end is still kind of bothering me, and I want to fill in the gaps in and around that 1K region. So to do that, I think I'm going to go with a specialty EQ, and I could either go with the Voss Slick EQ, but in this example, I think this music would serve better by something a little bit, dare I say, warmer, and I think we're going to go with the PTEQ-X in this example. All right, so I'm going to leave, I guess, oversampling off, stereo, that seems about right. Maybe we'll drive the input a little bit.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
So 2 definitely gives us the most kind of power, but I think it's maybe a little overpowering, so I think I might actually go with 88.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go in and around that region. So here we have a couple of different EQ modules as well as filters. I'm not going to use the filters. If we listen to the filter, I feel like it's going to take away all the power here.
Maybe we
Yeah.
shouldn't.
No way. Okay.
The technique is perfect.
Okay, so here we actually do have 20 for a low frequency, and we can attenuate some of that. So I think I'm actually going to take it up to 30 and then attenuate just a little bit here. Keep it maybe a little sharper.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Okay, that works for me. And then with a high frequency, I really would prefer something in more the range of 1K. So I'm not going to go and use here this 3K. I'm going to go up to the top module, choose 1K, and add a little bit of a boost here.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Getting a big gain mismatch.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more.
Let me go into that one section there.
Technique is perfect. The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. The technique is perfect. Just curiosity.
Okay.
Nothing more than that.
All All right, that works for me. And I think the next thing I want is some kind of again, like a gluing, a cohesive sort of compressor, something that can even clamp down a little bit more on the low frequencies. And to go for that, I might try the decam here.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
There's that shaker sound that's really loud.
Curiosity. Nothing more than that.
So why don't we actually have that be dipped out here dynamically a little bit.
Curiosity. Nothing more than that. Curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Just curiosity, nothing more than that. Just curiosity, nothing more than that.
Okay?
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
So part of the reason why I have the attack setting to be really fast is because I do want to get some of the peaks out right now using the compressor. And then if I wanted a slower compressor to follow it, I could actually very easily do that and go with, say, the M juice following it and go on the slow setting. Okay, so we get a little bit of both, best of both worlds, cutting down on those peaks a little bit with a compressor, and then also then letting some of them come through using the slow setting here on the Klang helm.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Let's group all these together to hear if we like what we've done.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
So this is a great example of a processing chain that's really starting to bring all of these really disjunct parts together a little bit more. Okay, there are a lot more incongruities, so to speak, with this mix coming in. And so a lot of our processing is being done as a means to bring it all back together a little bit. And now last but not least, we will go back in here and use the loud max to bring up the level a bit. I am worried about how extreme we can go, but let's test it out. Just going to go and give ourselves a 3 dB buffer at the top.
Maybe we shouldn't.
And I might drive some gain into this as well.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a more extensive processing chain than what we saw before, but I do think it needs it. every single processor is serving a role. As we can see, we have the high pass filter coming in. We've added a little bit of a low shelf dip that's going dynamically. We've gone in here and we've also put a little bit of another bell dip at a little bit of higher frequencies, trying to bring down those percussion noises. It seems to have helped a pretty good amount. We then brought in the PTEQ-X to be our cohesive specialty kind of EQ. We used it to take a little bit out of the low end, and then we also boosted up just a little bit here at 1K because that space was missing when we looked at the frequency spectrum. We then came in here and we used this decam free comp to compress down on those peaks a little bit, which are really sticking out and which you can really notice and see when you look at the waveform. So they're being brought down a little bit. Again, we're just at a 2 ratio, so nothing that extreme. And then as a means of kind of smoothing out beyond the transient, we went in and used the M juice. And this also has a dual role of being more of a specialty compressor, adding some character to the sound, and again, bringing it all together. And then last but not least, we went in with the Loud Max just to try to bring the level up a little bit. So if I go now and I go to the master and I bounce out this track, we can take a look and see the difference in the waveform and see just maybe how hard we really did compress it. And yeah, it's looking like a pretty big difference here. And by looking at this, we can see just how little instrumentation is really being used. And the peaks are still really sticking out, but there's just not a whole lot else to fill in those gaps. So I'm okay with that. And then obviously at the end, it's going to clamp down at that moment pretty hard. But I still want to make sure at the end of the track here, for example, that we do get some kind of a jump, because that's part of the whole effect. And it does kind of lose that a little bit, doesn't it?
Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect. Just curiosity. Nothing more than that.
Maybe we shouldn't.
The technique is perfect.
So on the whole, that's the idea with master bus processing. Everything is serving a purpose, and we really then have to be as objective as possible and determine, is it helping, is it hurting, and are there things where we should go back to the mix and make adjustments there? And I think in this track, it's pretty clear that, we should have gone back to the mix and made a lot of changes. That being said, that shows you the difference between the first course and where we're at here. We've really stepped up our game. We've added a lot of new features in, and we're also listening with a much more critical ear. And that's really what this all comes down to, and that's part of the learning process. And even thinking about things like master bus processing, or even just mixing and making music in general, the more you do it, the more experience you gain, the more critical you listen, and that ultimately determines every decision that you make. It still comes down to the person sitting behind the controls, not the plugins or software or hardware that you have. It requires somebody to put in those settings, somebody to think about and really analyze the mix, and that's a very human trait and something that hopefully, we can all learn and develop and at the end of the day, make really exciting music with.